The laughter came from the porch of the mercantile, and it was meant to be heard. "Look at the sleeve on her." Cordelia Vance leaned toward the two women beside her and did not lower her voice at all. "Gray wool over gray wool. She has patched the patch." Hannah Doyle stood at the counter inside with 4 bits of mending money closed in her fist and her back very straight. She did not turn around. She had learned that turning around only gave them something more to look at. The coat had belonged to her husband first, and then to the winter, and then to her, and the square on the left sleeve was cut from the hem of her only good skirt, because the hem was the last gray wool she owned in the world. She counted out the money for flour and salt. Her hand did not shake, which she considered a small victory. Behind her the bell over the door rang once, low and heavy, the way it rang when a big man came through it. Silas Crane owned more cattle than any 3 men in the county, and more land than most of them could ride across in a day, and he had not spoken more than a dozen words in town since the fever took his wife 2 winters back. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and he had heard every word of it. Everyone knew he had. The porch went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a lamp is knocked over, and nobody yet knows if it will catch. He crossed the floor and stopped beside her. "Mrs. Doyle, I need a housekeeper and a cook out at the Crane place. $6 a week, your own room, and the girl to be looked after." Hannah turned then. She had to. "Why? Because you mend a thing until it holds." He set his hat back on. "Wagon leaves in an hour." Nobody on that porch said one word as she walked out past them. The Crane Ranch sat 9 miles north where the land flattened and the wind came off the high ground without anything to slow it down. Hannah saw the house before she saw the herd, a long, low place of squared timber with a stone chimney at each end and a porch that ran the whole front of it, and every window in it dark at 4 in the afternoon. It was the finest house she had ever ridden up to, and it felt like a house where nobody lived. Inside, the floors were swept, and the pantry was stocked, and there was not one thing out of place. That was the trouble with it. A pair of boots by the door, and no coat on the pegs. A clock ticking in a room where nobody sat. The good dishes in the cupboard with dust on the rims because nobody had taken them down in 2 years. Silas set her carpetbag inside the door. "Kitchen is yours. Hands eat at 6. The last woman we had lasted 11 days. Why did she go?" He looked at the stairs and did not answer that. "The girl is Ruth. She is 6. She does not talk much. That was the whole of it." He went back out to the corral, and Hannah stood alone in a kitchen the size of the cabin she had shared with her husband, listening to a clock in another room. She found the child on the back step, sitting with her knees up and her arms around them, watching the wind move through the grass. Ruth Crane had her father in the jaw and somebody else in the eyes. She wore a good wool coat, store-bought, brown, without a single mark on it. She did not look up when Hannah sat down beside her, and she did not move away either. And Hannah decided that not moving away was the whole conversation for that day and did not spoil it by talking. They sat until the light went orange along the tops of the grass. Then a small hand came out and touched the gray square on the sleeve of the patched coat. Just the edge of it. Ruth traced the stitching all the way around, corner to corner to corner to corner, the way a person reads a word they cannot say out loud. Then she took her hand back and put it around her knees again. "Supper is at 6, Hannah told her. "There will be a chair for you whether you want it or not." Ruth did not answer, but she came inside when the sun went. That first week, Hannah learned the shape of the place. There were 9 hands living in the bunkhouse, and they had been eating salt pork and cold biscuit for a month because the cook had gone to Cheyenne, and nobody had the heart to ask Silas about hiring another. They came up to the house the first evening like men expecting to be disappointed and sat down to hot beef and onions and a pan of cornbread with butter melting into the split of it. And for a while the only sound in that kitchen was the sound of 9 men eating. An older hand named Otis Pike wiped his plate with the last of the bread. "Missus, I have been on this outfit 14 years, and that is the first cornbread that has come out of that stove since the funeral. Then eat the rest of it before it goes cold." She learned that Silas ate alone at the end of the long table with a ledger open beside his plate, and that he never once looked at the empty chair on his right, and that Ruth never once sat in it. She learned that the child got herself up in the morning and dressed herself badly, buttons wrong, and that nobody had taught her to plait her own hair because the person who used to do it was under a stone on the rise behind the house. She learned that Ruth had not spoken aloud in front of her father in a very long time. On the 9th morning, Hannah came down before light to start the stove and found the long table already set. Not the whole table. 2 places, her own place and the place beside it, and both of them laid out crooked and careful, the fork on the wrong side, the cup set too near the edge. Ruth was standing on a chair to reach the cupboard with the good dishes in it, the dishes with the dust on the rims, and she had taken down 2 of them and wiped them clean on the front of her nightgown. She looked at Hannah, waiting to be told to put them back. Hannah crossed the room and took the plates and set them down properly and moved the fork to the correct side without one word about any of it. Behind her, in the doorway to the hall, Silas Crane stood in his shirt sleeves with his suspenders down and watched his daughter climb off the chair. He did not say anything either. He went out to the corral, and he was gone an hour longer than he needed to be, and when he came back and his eyes were red from the wind, or from something that he was content to let a person call the wind. The good dishes stayed out after that. Nobody ever discussed it. By the end of October, she had the run of the house and had stopped asking permission for things. She took the curtains down and washed 2 winters of wood smoke out of them. She got the pantry in order and found 100 weight of dried apples nobody had touched. She went into the bunkhouse on a Sunday with her basket and came out at dark having mended 11 coats, 6 pairs of trousers, and 1 pair of gloves so far gone that Otis had been wearing them with his fingers coming through the ends since the spring. Every mend she put in got a square of gray wool if the tear was bad enough to need one, because gray wool was what she had. By November, there were 9 men riding the Crane Range with gray squares on their sleeves and elbows, and they wore them the way other men wear a brand. Then the wire went bad along the north fence, and Otis Pike came off his horse into it. They brought him up to the house with his forearm laid open from the wrist nearly to the elbow, and his sleeve black with it, and the nearest doctor 40 miles off in the wrong direction. 2 of the younger hands stood in the kitchen doorway with their hats in their hands, looking like they wanted to be anywhere else on the earth. Hannah cleared the table with one arm. "Lamp here. Another one there. Boil the water, and bring me the small pot, not the big one. Somebody take the girl outside." Nobody took the girl outside. Ruth stood flat against the pantry door with her eyes enormous, and Hannah looked at her once and made a decision. "Come here, then. Hold the lamp steady, and do not look at his arm. Look at his face. He needs somebody to look at his face." The child came and held the lamp with both hands and looked at Otis Pike, and Otis Pike, who was 53 years old and white to the lips, looked back at her and made a joke about how he had always wanted a matching set of scars, and now he would have one. Hannah cleaned the arm and closed it with the same small, even stitches she put in a torn seam, 31 of them, working steadily from the wrist up, and she talked the whole time about nothing at all, about apples and about a dog she had as a girl, because her mother had taught her that a voice in the room is worth as much as anything in the pot. Silas came in at the end of it and stood in the doorway with the cold still on him. He saw his daughter holding a lamp for a man with a torn arm and not crying. He saw a woman in a patched coat tie off the last stitch and cut the thread with her teeth because she would not take her hands away to reach for scissors. He saw the good dishes stacked out of the way on the sideboard where they had been moved in a hurry. He did not say one thing about any of it. But that night, when the house was quiet, he came into the kitchen where she was scrubbing the table down, and he stood with his hands in his pockets like a man who had forgotten how a conversation is started. My wife could do that. Close a wound. I never could. It is only sewing. It is not only sewing. He looked at the floor a while. She held the lamp. Ruth, she held the lamp. She did. She has a steady hand. Silas Crane nodded twice, slowly, and went up the stairs, and Hannah stood in the kitchen with her hands in the cooling water and understood that something in the house had shifted about 1/4 of an inch, and that 1/4 of an inch was a great deal. 2 mornings later, Hannah caught the child at the bottom of the stairs with her hair hanging in her face and half of it caught inside her collar. Sit on that step. Ruth sat. Hannah stood behind her and worked the tangles out from the ends upward, the way it is done if a person does not want to hurt. And then she plaited it in 3 parts and tied it off with a bit of blue ribbon out of her own workbasket. It took a long while. Neither of them was in any hurry about it. When it was finished, Ruth put her hand up and felt the whole length of the plait from the top of her head down, twice, like a person checking that a thing is really there. Then she got up and went out to the barn without a word, and Hannah heard her running the last part of the way. The trouble came from town, the way it usually does. It began with the wife of the bankman, because Cordelia Vance had a talent for saying a thing in such a way that she could later swear she had never said it. She said it at the sewing circle and at the church door and across the counter at the mercantile. A woman with nothing to her name goes out to the richest man in the county, and inside a month she has his kitchen and his kitchen table and his little girl calling her something she has no business being called. And him a widower, with a fortune and no sense about people. You can see the whole of it coming. Anybody could. By the middle of November, 2 of the church ladies had stopped bringing Hannah their mending. By the end of it, she went into the mercantile for thread, and the woman behind the counter took a long time finding it and gave her the wrong color. Then it reached the child, which is where it was always going to reach. Ruth came home from the schoolhouse on a Wednesday and would not eat and would not go out to the barn and sat on the back step in the cold with her arms around her knees exactly the way she had sat on the first day, and when Hannah came out and sat down beside her, she did not touch the sleeve of the coat. Somebody said a thing to you today. Ruth shook her head. Somebody said a thing about me. Ruth did not shake her head that time. Hannah looked out at the grass a long while and did not let one bit of it show on her face. Whatever they told you, they got it from a grown person at their own table. Children do not invent that kind of thing. They only carry it. You are not to carry it for them. The child leaned over and put her head against the patched sleeve and stayed there until the light went, and Hannah sat with her and thought very hard about a stage that ran east on Mondays. Then Marcus Vance rode out to the Crane place on a Thursday with his good hat on and a folder under his arm, and he did not ask for Silas. He asked for her. He sat in the front room he had not been invited into and laid the paper on his knee. Your late husband carried a note with the bank. $41 and some cents. It has been sitting since the spring out of respect for your situation. But respect does not go on forever, Mrs. Doyle, and there has been talk about your situation improving. Hannah looked at the paper. She knew the figure. She had known that figure in the dark for 2 years. I am paying it down, $2 a week since August. At $2 a week, you will be paying it into the next decade. He smiled the way a man smiles when he has already won. Of course, if a person came into other arrangements, the whole thing could be settled at once. That is the practical view. People in town are only wondering which sort of arrangement it will be. Say the thing you came to say. He stood and brushed his knee. Do not embarrass yourself, Mrs. A man like Crane will keep you as long as you are useful in that kitchen. He will not marry a woman the whole county has seen begging thread on credit. And the child will pay for it at school when the other children start repeating what they hear at home. You might think about the child. That was the sentence that did it. Not the money, the child. Hannah showed him out and stood on the porch until he was small on the road, and then she went upstairs and took her carpet bag off the top of the wardrobe and set it open on the bed and sat down beside it without putting anything in it. She was still sitting there when the light went. She did not hear the door. Ruth had a way of moving through that house like a cat through a fence. The child stood in the doorway in her nightgown and looked at the open bag on the bed for a long, long moment. Then she turned around and walked out. Hannah found the bag under her own bed in the morning, pushed all the way to the wall, with the buckles done up. The harvest social was held the first Saturday of December in the Grange Hall because the church was too small for it. And everybody in the county went, because there was nothing else to go to until spring. Hannah had decided to go and to say her goodbyes there in front of everyone, decently, and to be on the eastbound stage on Monday. She had decided this 3 times and unmade the decision twice. She wore the patched coat because it was the only coat she had. The hall was hot and loud and smelled of coffee and pine boughs and wet wool. Cordelia Vance held court by the cake table with 4 women around her, and when Hannah came through the door with the child beside her and Silas Crane a few steps behind, Cordelia let her voice do the thing it did so well. There, gray on gray. And on a Saturday. 2 of the women laughed. One of them had the grace not to. Hannah felt her face go hot, and she kept walking, and she thought, very calmly, that on Monday she would be 40 miles from anyone who had ever seen that sleeve. Then Ruth Crane took off her own coat. She did it in the middle of the floor, in front of the cake table and the fiddle players and half the county. And she held it up by the shoulders so that the sleeve hung down where everyone could see it. Stitched onto the left sleeve of that good brown store-bought coat, dead center, was a square of gray wool. It was sewn on with black thread in stitches the size of barley grains, crooked at 3 corners, the work of a person who had watched somebody do it and then done it alone in the dark without asking for help. The fiddles had stopped. Nobody had told them to. Ruth Crane looked up at the whole room, and for the first time in 2 years and 1 month, in front of her father and 40 other people, she used her voice. It came out thin and rusty and much too loud for the size of her. We match. Nobody in that hall moved. The child turned to Hannah, and her face came apart the way a face does when it has been holding something too heavy for too long. I did it myself. I did it on Tuesday. So you would match somebody. So you would not be the only one. Hannah went down on her knees on the floorboards of the Grange Hall in her patched coat and did not care who watched her do it. Do not take it off again. She was crying and shouting at the same time now, the way 6-year-old children do when a thing finally comes loose in them. Everybody says you will go. Papa will not say it. Nobody will say it. I want you to stay, and I want you to be my mama, and I do not care if the whole town hears me. The whole town heard her. Hannah held on to that child and could not say anything at all, and it did not matter, because the child had said all of it. Silas Crane had not moved from the door. He stood there with his hat in his hand, and he looked at his daughter holding on to a woman in a patched coat, and he looked at the gray square stitched crooked to a coat he had paid $9 for in Denver, and something went across his face that the people nearest the door talked about for years afterward. Then he crossed the room. He did not go to Hannah. Everybody expected him to go to Hannah. He went to the cake table, where Marcus Vance was standing with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Vance, the note on the Doyle place. Marcus Vance set the cup down. Not the time or the place for that, Crane. It is exactly the place. You brought it here first. Silas took a fold of banknotes out of his coat and counted them onto the white cloth of the cake table one at a time, slow enough that everybody in the hall could hear the sound of it, and the sound of it was the only sound in the hall. $41. And the cents. Bring me the paper. Vance did not move. Silas Crane looked at him. You rode out to my house on a Thursday and you spoke to a woman under my roof about her situation. You did it without me in the room, which tells everybody here what kind of man does that, so I will not have to say it. Bring me the paper. Marcus Vance went to his coat and brought the paper. Silas took it, looked at it once, and walked it the length of the hall to the iron stove in the corner, and opened the door of it, and the whole room watched $41 and 2 years of a widow lying awake in the dark go up in one bright curl of flame. He shut the stove door with his boot. Then he came back and stood in front of Hannah Doyle, who was still on her knees, and he held out his hand and pulled her up onto her feet and did not let go of her hand. He spoke to her, but he did not lower his voice, and the whole county heard it. I have been 3 months trying to find a way to ask you that would not sound like a man buying something. There is not one, so I will do it badly. Stay, marry me. Not for the kitchen. Not for the girl, though God knows the girl has more sense than her father. Stay, because that house has been dead for 2 years, and it is not dead now. Hannah looked at him. I have nothing, not one thing of my own. You know what they will say. I know exactly what they will say. Silas Crane turned around and looked at the room, and the room looked back at him, 40 faces and not one of them making a sound. Then he took off his coat. It was the best coat in the county, black wool, cut in Denver, the coat he had been married in and buried a wife in. He held it out to her across the cake table in front of Cordelia Vance and everybody else. Mrs. Doyle, there is a tear starting in the right elbow of this. I would take it as a kindness if you would put a patch on it. Gray, if you have got it. Hannah Doyle began to laugh, and then she was not laughing, and she took the coat. She patched it that same week, a square of gray wool cut from the last of the hem of her only good skirt, sewn onto the right elbow of the finest coat in the county, with 31 small even stitches. Silas Crane wore it to church on the 3rd Sunday of December and sat in the front pew with the patch turned out where the whole congregation could see it, and Ruth sat beside him with the crooked square on her sleeve, and Hannah sat on the other side of the child in the coat that had started the whole thing. Nobody laughed. It is a hard thing to laugh at a patch on the elbow of the richest man in the county. By the middle of January, something strange had happened in that town, the way strange things do happen when the top of a thing moves and everything under it moves after. The banker still had his position, but not his voice. Cordelia Vance came to the sewing circle in February with a small square of gray wool on the cuff of her sleeve and said, without being asked, that it was the practical thing to do in a hard winter and that she had always thought so. Nobody argued with her. Hannah, who had been invited back to the circle in January and had come, poured her a cup of coffee and said nothing at all. And that was the last of it. Otis Pike got the stitches out of his arm and kept the scar and showed it to anybody who would look. The mercantile started stocking gray wool by the bolt because they could not keep it in. They were married in the front room of the ranch house on a Tuesday in March, with the door open and the wind coming across the flat. Because Hannah would not have a church wedding, and Silas did not care one way or the other so long as it happened. Ruth stood between them the whole time and held on to the back of the patched coat with one fist. She talked now. She talked all the time, about the horses and the hands and the dog she wanted, and whether a person could live on cornbread alone. And some days Silas would stop in the middle of the yard just to listen to the sound of it coming out of the kitchen window. There is a row of pegs by the door of the Crane ranch house, inside, where the boots stand. On the first peg hangs a black wool coat cut in Denver with a square of gray on the right elbow. On the second hangs a gray coat with a square of gray on the left sleeve, the stitches so small and so even that a person has to stand close to find them. On the third peg, set low into the wood at the height of a child, hangs a brown store-bought coat with a crooked gray square sewn on with black thread, 3 corners of it wrong, and nobody in that house has ever been permitted to fix them.